So first I'll address the antidepressants thing. There's nothing wrong with it. Be careful though, because sometimes they can make you a little bit nauseous, so make sure you talk to your doctor. The first thing I did was I went to my primary care physician. She prescribed Lexapro. People have mixed feelings about taking medication, about taking antidepressants. I tried them like many years ago and had a good experience, so I was open to trying this again, thinking that it would be another good experience.
Now, drugs have been used for mental health problems for a long time. Prescription drugs have been very popular for at least the whole of the 20th century. Up until the 1950s and 1960s, drugs that were used in this way were not seen as rectifying a chemical imbalance. Even the drugs that were prescribed for mental health problems were generally seen as uppers or downers, sedatives or stimulants. Antidepressants are really very little different from placebo. If you look at all the literature, if you get hold of the unpublished studies, the difference is minimal. It's tiny, and it's probably, to my mind, accounted for by the fact that, as I was saying, if you're doing a placebo-controlled study with against a mind-altering substance, that's not really a fair comparison. It's not blinded. People are going to know what they're taking. That fits with the fact that actually the use of antidepressants hasn't really altered the outcome of depression, which is still pretty poor if you look at people who are receiving treatment for depression. So, for example, the large STAR-D study done in the United States, only 3% of the people in that study, who were all treated with at least one, and many of them with numerous antidepressants, actually recovered and remained well over the year follow-up period. And lots of studies have shown that people with depression who take antidepressants don't do any better, in fact, usually do rather worse than people with depression who don't take them.
I did not have a good experience. It worked at first. It worked for the first maybe 3 or 4 months. I noticed I didn't have any panic attacks during that time, which was amazing because it was kind of, oh man, it was getting really bad there for me for a while. And month 5, I noticed that the effect of the drug was kind of wearing off. I started getting panic attacks again.
When the amphetamines came in the 1940s, they were advertised as pet pills. They would make you smarter and sassier. When the barbiturates came in, they were advertised as sedatives, as downers, as things that would send you to sleep. And this was because until about the mid-20th century, no one thought there was much that could really be done for mental health problems. But that all changed from the 1940s with the introduction of these heroic procedures into psychiatry, which some of you may have heard of, you all will have heard of, because one of them, of course, was ECT. Another one, which came in the 1940s, was insulin coma therapy. And of course, there was lobotomy and other techniques. And some of these procedures, particularly insulin coma therapy and ECT, came to be thought of as acting in a specific way on the underlying disease, in a way that no previous widely accepted treatment had done before. Of course, most of these procedures, particularly insulin coma therapy, were since found to be completely useless, as well as being very dangerous. It had a death rate of about 10%. So by the time modern drugs arrived in the early 1950s, the point is that psychiatry already believed it had some specific treatments, some treatments that were actually treating the disease in some way. When modern drugs first came in, the first one that was introduced was the first drug we still use, was called chlorpromazine, largactil, thorazine. I'm sure you will have heard of it. They were very popular, and their use spread rapidly throughout the old mental hospitals in Europe and America, helped in America by a massive pharmaceutical company-aided promotion campaign, which included the chief executive of the company going on national primetime television to announce this great medical breakthrough. But Despite the fact that they were very popular, they were not at first seen as acting in a specific or targeted way, in the way that they are now being promoted as acting. So the first two psychiatrists who used chlorpromazine were called Delay and Denneker, Jean Delay, Pierre Denneker, who were both working in Paris. And they believed that chlorpromazine and other early antipsychotics were essentially special sorts of sedative, different from the sedatives they'd had before, but sedatives, things that worked on the nervous system to suppress or dampen it in some way. Lots of adverts advertised these drugs for all sorts of conditions. So they were advertised for anxiety, they were advertised for behaviour problems in children, they were widely promoted at this time for agitation and aggression in elderly people, what they've been used for and criticised for being used for recently, of course. By 1970, this is an advert for Mellaril in 1970, that's all changed, and it's now being advertised as targeting specific symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia. And you get the same sort of story with antidepressants. The first drugs that were called antidepressants were essentially stimulant-type drugs, drugs that were used to treat TB that had stimulant effects, and were known to send people psychotic, incidentally. So quite similar to amphetamines. And first of all, they were described as stimulants, but gradually they started to be distinguished from stimulants and to be called antidepressants and to be claimed to be doing something specific in the condition of depression.
And I noticed that things that normally would excite me and make me happy weren't really doing that as much. I just felt kind of like I was becoming numb to the world. I went back to my doctor and I told her how the drug was affecting me and how I didn't like the way it made me feel, how it wasn't even really effective anymore, and how it was making me gain weight. The solution to me saying I don't like the way this drug is affecting me was to double the dose. She was like, okay, well right now you're only on 10 milligrams. We're going to just go ahead and up that to 20.
The way that drugs used to be understood as working and the way that I'm suggesting they should be understood as working, the drugs that we currently have at any rate, is what I've called this drug-centered model. And this is the idea that far from normalizing the body or the brain, the drugs that we use actually create an abnormal or an altered state. They are mind and body altering substances. That, of course, is what a drug is. But psychiatric drugs are mind-altering. That's the really important property that they have. They are an example of a psychoactive substance. Psychoactive substances, of course, also include recreational drugs like alcohol, nicotine. The important point is that this change did not happen because a whole load of studies were done which proved that what drugs were really doing was reversing underlying diseases or abnormalities or chemical imbalances. There was no scientific research set up then, and there's almost no scientific research now to demonstrate that the disease-centered model is the correct way of thinking. I think this change occurred because people wanted it to occur, because psychiatrists wanted it to occur, because they desperately wanted to be able to offer real medical treatments that made a real difference to what they were suggesting was an underlying disease process. It also happened because it was politically expedient. The idea that there were drug treatments that could cure people was very helpful to politicians who wanted to empty out and close down the old asylums and to pretend that issues that were raised by mental disturbance, mental disorders, had been solved.
I had just sat there and explained how uncomfortable it was making me and all these negative side effects, and the solution was take more of it. Take more of that thing that is making you feel like shit. So I went to a new doctor that agreed that taking it was maybe not the best option for me. She gave me a very low dose and a very small amount of Xanax. Klonopin is another barbiturate that people can get prescribed for panic attacks and things like that, but it's a longer lasting drug and you kind of just take it every day. And I told her I don't really want to be reliant on a medication. I don't want to take something every day. Xanax I know is dangerous because it can be very addictive to people. I'm not the kind of person that has an addictive personality, so I'm not worried about it. I've had the prescription now for like a month, and I've taken 3.
So what might constitute, I just want to think about evidence for a couple of minutes, although I'm not going to go into it in great detail. There's lots of stuff in my book and things on the web that I've written as well, if you want more references. The first point to make is that the vast majority of evidence that is held up to support the idea that psychiatric drugs work does not distinguish how they work, because that evidence is placebo-controlled trials. If you compare a mind-altering substance with a placebo, obviously people are going to feel and behave and act and think differently. So the fact that there are some changes in a mania rating scale or a depression rating scale or a psychosis rating scale or anything else doesn't indicate that that drug has had any fundamental effect on an underlying process. I think a really important thing is to realise that drugs can't do anything and everything. So this is just a random list of some effects that psychoactive, mind-altering drugs produce. Some of them produce euphoria, make people giddy and high. That's not the same thing as making people happy. So I think it's really important to not to just equate the effects of drugs with other experiences. Just think a bit about what the familiar drugs that are used in psychiatry are doing. And I'm sure you can probably tell me more about this than I can tell you. What's interesting is that these early psychiatrists described what the early antipsychotics like chlorpromazine were doing to people in a lot of detail. And what's interesting about that is that the interest that they had in how these drugs affected and altered and changed people has been lost. You won't find an account of how Zyprexa changes people in this sort of way in the modern literature at all, except what I've managed to publish. But they were pretty honest about it, okay? Chlorpromazine makes people indifferent, delays their responses, decreases initiative and preoccupation, without quite just sending people to sleep like the barbiturates did. That's what they noticed.
But I know that there's more to it than that. There's more in my life that I need to, this is like a Band-Aid. This helps prevent a serious panic attack once it's started, but I want to get to the point in my life where I don't feel those feelings to begin with, and I think the only way to do that is behavioral therapy. My doctor did mention that there are other types of antidepressants that I might consider in the future that don't cause weight gain. I think Wellbutrin is one, Luvox is one. So there are other options.
Denneker went even further than this, and he suggested that what the drugs were doing was replacing the psychosis or schizophrenia with a neurological syndrome, a neurological disease, which was pretty similar to Parkinson's disease. If you push the dose up, you got all the sort of frank symptoms of Parkinson's. People got, very, very stiff and very slowed up. At lower doses, you just got primarily the mental symptoms, the mental slowing and the emotional flattening. And he said this, this is how they work. This is what we're intending to do. We're trying to make people a bit Parkinson-like. And that fits with what people say about the drug and people's experiences certainly of the older antipsychotics. People describe them as making them feel stagnant and heavy and slow and emotionally dampened or emotionally empty. Some of the newer drugs are a little bit different. So I think olanzapine and clozapine are a little bit different. They still have this effect of inducing lethargy and emotional indifference, but this seems to be associated less with sort of physical rigidity and restriction and more with metabolic effect. So people get this real compulsion to eat. And of course this was, this information was suppressed for a long time, but I think this quote sums it up nicely. I've never been able to eat as much as I did when I was on Zyprexa, I gained 40 pounds in no time, and my mind was in a constant fog of lethargy and indifference. I didn't care about anything, I just wanted to sit around and eat. Lots of adverse effects of antipsychotics that I'm sure you're probably aware of. Just a couple of things I want to say that I think don't come out strongly in the literature. Tardive dyskinesia, it's a neurological condition. It consists of abnormal involuntary movements. That's what's highlighted, but actually there's quite a lot of evidence that there's some mental impairment associated with it as well. There's been more evidence recently about reduced brain volume. I was talking to someone before I started about Peter Bregin's work. I read Peter Bregin's Toxic Psychiatry when it came out in the early 90s, and I thought, this is really interesting, but he's going too far. It just can't be true that the drugs cause brain shrinkage and these large ventricles. He's just totally over the top. Recent evidence shows that he was almost certainly right. There was a big trial in America that showed that haloperidol and olanzapine caused visible shrinkage of the brain within weeks. There was a study on macaque monkeys that showed that both of those drugs caused the monkeys to have smaller brains. And there's been a long-term follow-up recently that shows the same thing. The more antipsychotics you're on, the more the brain diminishes in volume over time.
I think Wellbutrin is one, Luvox is one. So there are other options, and we'll see how I fare with therapy and just doing what I'm doing and exercise and, keep doing my thing. And if I need to go on that at some point, I will update you and let you know if I have negative side effects or my experience with that.
What are antidepressants in terms of the sort of psychoactive and physical effects that they have? Tricyclic antidepressants are very similar drugs to chlorpromazine, so they're very sedative and not very nice to take, cause slowing up of mental processes, and some of them have some of these neurological effects at higher doses. Newer antidepressants have much weaker psychoactive effects, so they don't actually make everyone feel that different, but they do have some psychoactive effects, and these are some of them. They seem to have this odd capacity that drugs like the SSRIs and venlafaxine, which I looked at recently, of making people feel both a little bit lethargic and some people also feeling a bit sort of tense and hyper and irritable as well. And they also seem to definitely have this capacity to make people feel emotionally a bit numbed or distant. As far as treating depression is concerned, there's really no evidence that any drug has the ability to reverse depression or to make people's mood any better. There are lots of drugs that can make you high temporarily, but that's not the same thing. But there are drugs with psychoactive effects that can suppress emotions generally, but that's not the same thing. But essentially what I'm saying is what most people are being told these days, or for a long time have been told about antidepressants, is that you should take them because they will help normalise your serotonin levels. That is just not true. There's just no evidence to support that at all.